Tonight we are looking at not local, not internal or individual. We're trying to look at the whole ummah as a whole, uh, and to discuss some of the challenges facing the whole global ummah, which of course includes us as well. As you know, the Prophet ﷺ was sent to the whole of humanity. Allah mentioned, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. That the Prophet ﷺ, we have sent him as a mercy to all the worlds. So both the jinn and the human being, the Prophet ﷺ was sent to them. And that's why in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he wrote letters to different kings and governors of different lands, inviting them to Islam, because his mission was not intended to be just Makkah, Medina, and Saudi Arabia. He came to bring Islam to the whole of humanity. And so it has always been that goal, to create a global community, that Islam, if it's from Allah, it has to be available and be enjoyed by all of humanity. And so built in within the religion itself is this beautiful concept of Hajj, in which the whole global ummah get to congregate every year and to get to introduce themselves to each other and to see each other, and to if you're allowed to do trading in Hajj and business and so on, to get to interact and to develop that beautiful relationship. And so in the short time we just want to highlight some of the major challenges that the global ummah faces. I want to preface it by saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. The believers are brothers, and this is an ayah that we did in Surah Al-Hujurat, the 49th chapter. The believers are brothers. So Allah created a new form of brotherhood. It was not before Islam. Brotherhood was based on your tribe, on your family, on your, it was based on ties like that. And the Prophet ﷺ came with the revolutionary idea that brotherhood is based on belief. It was a new concept. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expressed it here. The believers are brothers, so reconcile and make peace between your brothers and remain conscious of Allah, have taqwa for Allah, so that you will receive His mercy. And then the Prophet ﷺ, in letting us understand how the whole ummah tied together, he said the believers in their mutual kindness, compassion, and sympathy are like one single body. When one of the limbs suffers, the whole body responds with restlessness and fever. And so what this hadith is telling us is that when we're looking at the believers globally, all over the earth, he says it's like one single body, which means, in your body, if you hurt your finger, you get fever, your whole body becomes restless. So he's saying that if one part of the ummah is suffering or hurting, then the whole of the ummah should feel that and do something about it. So we are not allowed to just ignore one part of the ummah that may be suffering because we are not suffering and we think that it's okay for us. No, we have to worry about that, and we have to respond and try to assist in whatever way we can. So we'll first look at some of the internal challenges. And because we have discussed internal challenges, a lot of different classes, we're not going to spend too much time on it, but we want to look at external challenges, which are greater and more. But usually the thing that will destroy the Muslim ummah, it's from internal. There's a hadith which mentioned that it is from inside your own self, that, your own community, in which decay and confusion will happen. And so, first of all, we have internally, the Muslims, they follow one book, the Quran, they follow one sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, but within that have become different strains of understandings, of interpretations that have led Muslims to become disconnected from one another. And so you have, for example, some Muslims, they study the same Quran and they derive from it a very conservative, strict point of view. This is, for example, in Saudi Arabia and some countries, very strict interpretation of the Quran and the practices of Islam. Then you have Tabligh Jamaat, which is like the largest Islamic group in the world. They have a particular understanding also of how they understand Islam. In a previous class, we also talked about that to some extent. So I'm not going to go into detail because we're going to cover quite a lot of information today. The modernists, these are the people who they are bent on making Islam fix itself to suit the modern practices. They are embarrassed that Islam seems outdated, is not up to date with what they consider to be modern and hip. And so they make a great deal of effort to reinterpret Islam to suit the agenda of the day. So if Islam has something that it is prescribed, for example, hijab, or anything that is prescribed which seem to be out of fashion with modern day practices, they tend to reject those in Islam or try to reinterpret them in another way. So these are the modernists. Then you have the liberalists, the progressives, who also try to go to the other extreme of watering down the teachings of Islam to such an extent that they want almost every practice to be acceptable and fit within the tent of Islam. No matter how immoral it is or how far it may go, they try to find a way that it will come under the Islamic tent. And sometimes they end up really deviating and going very far, in which they include in Islam practices which really are not part of it. And then you have the extremists who interpret everything as a black and white, that Islam against the rest of the world, and they adopt very extremist, anti-non-Muslim, anti-everything, so their position is very, very strong. And so you have all of these different theological interpretations of Islam within the religion, and they all clash with each other, and they serve to create a disunity, and they end up having Muslims being pit against one another and arguing against one another. So that's one of an internal challenge that is very big. And because the caliphate no longer exists, we don't have a single authority that can say this is the position. So we don't have any single authority. So everyone's position is equally valid, and they think that they have an equal argument. And so it becomes actually a fight between scholars of whose scholarship is more and whose one is more accepted, and so on. And then you have, after colonialism, Muslim countries became broken up into nation states, and these different nation states, they end up having their own. So you have now Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Palestine, Libya, all of these different countries, and each of them developed and created their own ways of how they will rule their countries. There are some countries that still exist. There's about 57 majority Muslim countries in the world. So what happens, some of them still propagate and say that they're following the hudud laws, the punishment laws of Islamic Sharia. But a lot of the Muslim majority countries don't claim to follow Sharia laws specifically. Among those countries which still proclaim that they're going to establish some of the Sharia rules are Saudi Arabia, Iran, Brunei, Afghanistan. Malaysia has a kind of a dual political system in which they have secular laws for the non-Muslims, and then they have Sharia laws for the Muslims. You have Iraq. Iraq is more like a French/Shia rule of government that they have. So it's a kind of a piece of that, and a piece of French law, and a piece of Shia. Of course, Iran is Shia. You have places like Indonesia, Sudan, Pakistan, Nigeria, mostly in the north of Nigeria, where most Nigeria have Christians and Muslims. Most of the northern Nigeria is Muslims. And so they still practice some of the hudud laws. That means punishing people for different things. And Qatar also says that they're following Sharia. So you have these different countries that still profess that they are following Sharia, but all of them, there's varied understanding. So you have other countries like Jordan and Libya that don't profess Syria. They don't profess to follow Sharia law. So all these different political countries, which are all Muslims, but they don't see eye to eye on so many things because they have created nation states which have created in them this attitude of nationalism, which is antithesis to Islam, and they view each other from this perspective. So those create a serious internal challenge for Muslims when they're trying to hold a unified position on any particular matter. It becomes very difficult to do. Regarding external challenges, the first major one really is the economic challenges. Almost the majority of the Muslim countries, they do not follow the Islamic economic system, because of the nature of the dominance of the West and their dependence on the West. Most of the Muslim countries are forced, one way or the other, to interact with the world economy, and so they have allowed themselves to be convinced that the Islamic economic system cannot work, is not viable. But we do have banks, Islamic banks, that still operate. Among the banking assets, the majority is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has about 31% of all the banking assets. Malaysia, there's Islamic banking in Malaysia, 16%. UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Turkey, so like 5% of. So they do have some effort being made to establish Islamic banks, to make loans available interest-free. But by and large, the Muslims are unable to organize themselves economically to be able to benefit from the principles of Islam in terms of the economy. And then the Muslim, they lack manufacturing industries. So they have an abundance of resources. The Muslims have a lot of natural resources in their lands that they can, utilize, but they're unable to create the industries that are needed to be able to harness those natural resources. And so they become dependent on the West to provide those products when they themselves, if they develop industries, they can produce those products by their own selves. So that's a big challenge facing Muslims. Despite being fairly wealthy, a lot of Muslim countries, because of oil, they are unable to have any kind of economic power that they can wield any kind of power. Political challenges. So we talk a little bit about the nation states. Muslims have unable to, the OIC is probably the closest attempt that they tried, Organization of Islamic Countries, but so that still has not been able to bring to fruition and brought the unity to the Muslims that is needed. So they really don't have no true representative organization, like how you have the European Union. You have different countries that will come together in alliances. The Muslim countries have not been able to organize themselves in this way where they collectively stand for Islam and everything Islamic. In fact, the opposite is true. There's a lot of regional rivalries. They have a long-standing conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran is Shia and Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And so this conflict has always been there between these two countries. And this is a huge problem for the Muslims because it always pit one against the other. This has led to a lot of confrontation and conflict. The latest is when people from Iran invaded Yemen, tried to take over the country, and then Saudi Arabia attacked them in Yemen, ended up basically attacking Yemen and destroy the country. We produced one of the largest refugees from those Yemenis who were always poor. And so we ended up having this war in which Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen and the fellow Muslims, and the Prophet ﷺ spoke highly of Yemenis people. And in other words, to say to give them honor and respect and so on, all that is on through the door. Then you had the people of Syria who had a long problem with their rulership, and Syria also have Christians. They attempted to overthrow Bashar Assad, and that didn't go as planned and didn't go well. And so we ended up with a very messy situation in which you have people trying to overthrow the government and unable to do so, and then the government gaining back strength and massacring them and destroying them, and we ended up having so many Syrians leaving their country. The civilians who were not part of this attempted coup, but became victims of this. You have continued to have the Palestinian conflict, which is about 6-something years now, in which the Palestinian people don't have a homeland that they can call independently their own. Palestine becomes a global conflict for us because we have one of the third holiest places, Masjid al-Aqsa, which is located in Palestine. And so globally, Muslims have always been connected and concerned that this is one of our holy places and it has to be free. It has to be accessible. It cannot be controlled by just one particular group of people, especially who are not Muslims. And so this has been a constant conflict that continues as we speak to create this huge issue. Historically, for a long time, Muslims and Palestine, like from the 1800s all the way back in this Muslims' history, they have never had real conflict with Jews. The Jews have always been very close. The Muslims have always been very generous to the Jews. They never had this issue. It's only from the 1950s coming forward that we begin to have this severe disconnect between Muslims and Jews. And so that is an issue. Throughout the Middle East, you have all kinds of different political instability, where they had uprising in Egypt, you had Libya, you had Algeria. There's so many places in which Iraq. So the Muslim world, as we know it, went through and still goes through a severe form of dysfunction, as many of those societies were erupted. You have a growing youth population right now. As I speak, people are protesting in Iran, because pulling off their hijab in protest to have freedom of religion, freedom to be able to decide for themselves, how they should practice their faith because of the death of a young girl. And so we have all of this serious disorganization and crisis in a lot of the Muslim world. And that's a big challenge, because when you don't have societies that are safe, that are organized, how are you practicing Islam? How are you raising a child? It becomes very stressful and very frustrating to the average Muslim to be able to survive in those kind of situations, much less to thrive. In terms of the global Muslim Ummah, we also have social challenges. That's another thing. It has become fashionable to attack Muslims, and physically beat them up, in subways and every place. We have somehow the world has decided that Muslims are, the easiest target. And so we have become the object of so many attacks and deaths and killing and so on. One of the groups that have killed a large amount of Muslims, ISIS themselves, under the name of Islam, pretending to be Muslim and destroying Muslims. Then we have fatwas which are issued calling for the deaths of scholars and Muslim scholars and such fatwas. They tend to we have people who have been called up and issued death sentences. Muslim governments, as soon as someone shows some kind of criticism against anything that they do, they issue death sentences. We have a beautiful brother. He was doing a podcast or something. I think it was Ra'id or something like that in Saudi Arabia, and they just sentenced him 10 years. We recently had an imam who spoke out against all the liberalization in Saudi Arabia. That this is the imam of the Haram, one of the most respected people, the imam of the Haram, and they sentenced him to 10 years in jail for one speech that he gave, basically saying, all of this, bringing concerts and musical concerts to Saudi Arabia and so on, is going to create problems for the young people and so on. For that act of just saying that speech, Saudi Arabia sentenced him to 10 years in prison. So you have these kinds of things. And then Muslims in minority countries, for example, in Myanmar and so many places, people are turning on Muslims in Sri Lanka. Muslims are being persecuted. In India, the atrocities are incredible of what is happening to Muslim minorities in so many parts of the world. Part of the social challenges facing Muslims is a lack of modern education in so many of the Muslim countries. And so what happened, the populace remains very uneducated, and so they are unable to navigate and to know how to improve life. We also have a barrage of media that continues to spew Islam, un-Islamic understandings of the teachings of Islam. Still, Islam remains a misunderstood faith by even Muslims themselves. We don't even understand our basic faith, and then when we look at the media, we can't even recognize what they're talking about in the name of Islam. And then suppression of civil liberties continues to happen. You have countries which pretend to be advocates of freedom of speech, but persecuting Muslims. For example, France, forcing sisters not to wear hijab. In fact, they're putting a fine on them. They charge you if they find you wearing hijab. So you have civil liberties of Muslims being suppressed. And this creates a big challenge for Muslims to survive and to try to thrive in societies like this. Regarding the misconceptions of Islam, this has become really a big deal. You have the media, mainly pushed by Western media, developing these derogatory tags of calling Muslims fundamentalists. Now, the word fundamentalist by itself is a beautiful word. Nothing is wrong with a fundamentalist. Fundamentalist means a person who practices the fundamentals of their faith, just like a Christian fundamentalist or a Jewish fundamentalist. But when we say the Muslim fundamentalist, it somehow seems to carry a different connotation, that somehow they are crazy and they're extremists. Muslims are called extremists, they're called terrorists. All these labels get posted to Muslims. And so the Muslims find themselves in a constant state of trying to explain ourselves, trying to defend a position which we're not. A lot of the terminology of Islam is being hijacked. Word like madrasa, which means school, that we teach the kids, have now been given a connotation that is supposed to be derogatory. Muslims are being called violent, that Islam is a religion of violence. The old lie of Islam was spread by the sword. The irony is that the word sword is mentioned many times in the Bible. The word sword is not mentioned in the Quran. Yet somehow Islam is supposedly to have been spread by sword. La ikrah fi din, Allah says in the Quran, that there is no compulsion in religion. To think that Muslims went about spreading Islam by the sword is such a crazy idea. What sword spread Islam in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Africa? There were no hordes of Muslims going to these countries and physically forcing them to accept Islam. So this is still being spread, and people still buy into the idea that Islam is intolerant to other faiths. That Islam considers other faiths as enemies. And this again puts the Muslim in a very bad place, because they are seen as an enemy rather than as a friend, and that Islam has no social justice. And then it got worse after 9/11, because for the first time, Islam was seen as a threat to global peace. It became the scenario that was created was that the Muslims are a threat to the world peace. And so it became okay to attack Muslims, to persecute them, and to do whatever it is, because we're trying to keep peace. In the name of peace, it's okay to do that to Muslims. So all of these things pose a great deal of challenge for the average Muslim to deal with, who goes to work and then treated like if they're some criminal or some enemy or some, and our young people, many of them have been killed, and different difficulties have happened to them in the jobs and workplace as well. through no fault of theirs. The reality is the Muslims are some of the nicest, most peace-loving people that you will ever meet. That's the whole irony of the whole thing. And then about 25 years ago, they had this discussion that began with, and it got accelerated after 9/11, about the concept of clash of civilizations. You see, as Muslims reacted to being invaded in their countries, like the Taliban reacted in Afghanistan because they were invaded, Muslim countries, Iraq was invaded, so as people went into Muslim countries and they reacted physically trying to fight back, it became seen as though Islam and the West were two civilizations that are traveling on a road in which they are going to be hitting head on, that they are two, is a clash of civilizations, and that Islam is anti-West, that is diametrically opposed to the Western values and the Western ideas. And the reality is Allah has created Islam in such a way that Muslims can operate in any type of society very easily, as we have shown worldwide. Muslims are minorities in many countries. They don't pose a threat to the country. They are not looking to impose their ideology on that country. Muslims in the majority countries are very tolerant, like in Egypt, where you have Coptic Christians live peacefully, almost 20% of them. They live very peacefully among the Muslims, not being harassed or intimidated. So Muslims have always had a history in which they are able to live very safely and very comfortable with people of different faiths. When you begin to present Islam as anti-West, as a clash of two civilizations, then what you're doing is you're forcing people to change sides, to take a side, and that you can't be Western and Islamic at the same time. I can't be an American Muslim. I have to pick either being American or being Muslim. I can't have both. And so that is a dangerous conversation, and it puts the Muslim Ummah in a place where their lives become at stake. We talk a little bit about Muslim disunity. This also, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, that part of what will happen to us is we will break up from within. It has always been that this Sunni Shia difference, right, that has existed. Many scholars have tried to find ways to accommodate one another. And so the Shia have a very particular perspective. The Sunni, we have done previous classes on this. So you have that exists. The Sunni are roughly about 88% of the Ummah. The Shia is about 12%, and then they break up into subsects among themselves. So the majority of the whole Ummah globally are Sunni Muslims. But of course, they are broken down into the different interpretive groups that we talked about. So you have that kind of difference. Then you have nation states, which we mentioned before, with petty quarrels, all kinds of ridiculous causes to be going at each other. And this creates a huge problem for the regular Muslims who live in these countries. A lot of the Muslim world is still ruled by dictators, tyrants, under the label of kings and monarchs, leaders for life, scenarios which, from one way or the other, it is one family or one group of people who have become dictators over the Muslim community, whereas the Islamic teaching is that the people should elect their rulers, and there should be freedom of election. There should be freedom for people to voice dissent and to pick their leaders from this. And all of this is not at the moment happening. And so we have this odd situation in which the Muslims, the regular Muslims on the street, have allowed themselves to be manipulated and controlled and dictated to by a very few elite group of people who rule the country, steal all its wealth, and just keep the people in subjugation. And because the population is very poor, not educated, they're unable to rise up and to be able to change these rulership. There was some attempt in this past recent 10, 12 years in Egypt and in Syria and in Algeria and in Libya of the young people trying to change the leadership. of these tyrants who are there 40 years, 30 years, 25 years, just usurping the resources of the Muslims. And so the leaders themselves, because they're not interested really in establishing Islam in the land, they are incapable of keeping Muslims secure and keeping the well-being and establishing Islam, because their agenda is not necessarily to share Islam and to spread Islam. Islam is seen as a tool to be used by them to keep the masses down. So there's no genuine intention to, as a leader by these communities, to really spread the beautiful message of Islam, to share the resources of the Muslims, to help the common Muslim to be able to rise to his highest potential. You don't find that in these Muslim countries. We also spoke briefly about fundamentalism as a concept. It gets associated with extremism. So one of the things that has happened sometimes, when you're practicing your faith, you've got to understand that there's a reason why our faith is called the balanced path, the middle path, because the Muslims don't become extremists in either direction. When one of the companions wanted to fast the whole month, the Prophet ﷺ stopped it. So it was not becoming extremism in piety or extremism in kufr. So Islam is a religion of balance. And so when you are practicing your fundamentalist Muslim, practicing your faith, you've got to understand that it is balance. Secondly, your practice of Islam should not be imposed on anybody else. Not because you're a very pious person means that you will shove that down the throat of someone else. Each of us have our own journey. Each of us is at different parts of that journey in terms of getting close to Allah and learning our faith and practicing it. And so none of us have been made judge and jury and executioner for our next Muslim. We are asked advice, ad-din nasiha. The Prophet said, the religion is about advice, giving good advice to people. You can practice however strong you want to practice your faith, but you're not allowed to just impose that on someone else. All of us have to, by freedom of our will, find a way to get close to Allah by your exhortations, by your example, but you can't have that, an extremism tries to force their point of view on everyone else. And if you don't accept that, you're considered an enemy. You're either in or out. You're with me or against me. There's no third position. There's no neutral position. And so that kind of behavior by Muslims have led to a lot of people having a wrong understanding of Islam. And then they have their pseudo scholars, because they're very learned scholars in Islam. The true scholars of Islam never supports extremism. So you find all these different extremist group, ISIS, whatever you call them, the Taliban in Afghanistan and so on. They don't have credible scholars who are advising them, because credible scholars will never advocate for throwing acid in the face of a young girl because she wants to go to school. Credible scholars will not do that. Killing of a Muslim just because he doesn't follow your group. All of those things that happen are not happening because, so you have these extremist scholars who give their own understanding of the religion, but they have no credibility among the true scholars of Islam who have spoken out time and again against them. One of the beautiful concepts of our religion is a concept called jihad. And this is a beautiful concept in our religion. It has now become associated with violence. It has taken on a new meaning. The Western media has taken time to allow this word to mean killing of innocent people in the name of jihad. Jihad in Islam is simple. It means, and I think we did a class on jihad, it is to strive with your nafs and yourself and struggle and have patience as you strive to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Part of jihad also is if someone attacks you, you're allowed to defend yourself to the extent that you're out of danger. And once you're out of danger, you stop. So an aspect of jihad is where you have to defend it. And even if it means physical defense, confrontational defense, then that is allowed. So that's the essence of jihad. the concept that has been portrayed by the West is that it is a holy war. The word holy war is not mentioned in the Quran, nowhere in our sources. This is a term coined by Christians who had used it for their crusades in the past. And they tried to bring this term and sling it onto Muslims. We don't consider jihad holy war. We don't consider war. We don't so when you translate jihad as holy war, then you're deliberately misleading people to create an impression in the minds of people that Muslims are waging a holy war against everyone who is not Muslim. And all of this, again, becomes a challenge for us to be able to deal and mitigate all of that. Then we have, the France, Britain, Italy, all these countries, they had gone out in the world, they colonized a large part of the world, especially Britain. They came to countries, they massacred, you may not know it, but when the Britain came to India, they massacred thousands of ulama. They had a specific campaign to shed the blood of the ulama of the Muslims. And they massacred thousands of Muslim imams and scholars, the British. So they came and they colonized all these countries, raped their resources, brutalized their people in the name of expansion of their particular country. And because they had more military power and technology available, they were able to come to these countries and literally destroy them, enslaved people, moved them from their home countries to different places based on the economic reality of what they needed. That's part of how slavery came to America as well in the Caribbean. Now colonization has become unfashionable, not fashionable anymore. No longer can it stand because technology has developed, countries have advanced, and so this is no longer a tenable, viable way of operating in the world. So this has now been replaced with a new form of colonization called globalization, in which businesses and other organizations are connecting internationally and creating conglomerates that now control the resources and the business. And now countries are unable to compete, and they now are being forced, literally, in order to get resources, they're forced to subjugate themselves to these companies and these global organizations. So it has become a new form of colonization. The international community and the globalization, and the people who are the biggest and benefits the most from globalization is the West. So an aspect of that, for example, you'll find in Muslim countries, despite whatever it is, there is still a sense of haya. There is sense of sense in the Muslim of a moral, spiritual dimension to what they do. Despite all that is happening in the Muslim world, there's something still of the fitrah of the Muslim community, of the Muslim nations, of the Muslim people, that causes them, whenever they are doing their day-to-day business, to still have a sense of consciousness of morality. But then you're dealing with the West, which have basically relegated morality as something irrelevant to living in the daily life. And so when you are trying to compete from a moral standpoint with someone who has no moral anchor, it becomes very difficult. You're dealing with an immoral person who's have no boundaries and willing to do anything, even to kill you. You find it at a disadvantage to be able to deal with such people. And so globalization has now entered the fray and is slowly taking over. You have China, which is going in every part of Africa, Muslim countries. And because these countries are developing and they need economic resources, China comes and says, I'll give you as much money as you need. Whatever you want to build, airport, this, that, you tell us, we'll build everything for you. We bring our workers from China, and then afterwards we control you. So Muslim countries are finding it very difficult to be able to survive in that kind of environment and be independent, to establish and to be the master of their own destinies. And then we have a leadership crisis. We talk a little bit about in the Muslim world, corrupt leaders are forced sometimes by circumstances to deal with corrupt superpowers. Because if Pakistan or one country we need help, like Egypt, a very poor country, so we need the help of the United States to buy grain to feed our people or to get stuff. In order to get that, we've got to compromise something. So they've created the IMF, which lends you the money through this agency and then dictates to you how you must run your country. And so you become the leaders. If they want to do anything significant in their country, they are forced to become corrupt. They're forced to compromise. And then we have the leaders themselves. And so egocentric, they're this ruling elite that develops, not only think of themselves and their own families and don't care for the Muslims. And so we have a crisis of leadership in the Ummah. And then illiteracy. The religion began with Iqra, right? Which is one of the most foundational commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Read, become educated, and yet despite this faith being grounded on the basis of knowledge, of learning, of reasoning, that Allah constantly in the Quran resorts to asking the believers, tadabbur, tafakkur, to think, to ponder all the time, and to think about what the Quran invites you, to challenge it, to have critical thinking, to tell the Muslim knowledge is the last property, of the wisdom is the last property of the Muslim. So despite all of that, somehow the Muslims have allowed themselves to be where, I give you an example of the top countries that the illiteracy rate is extremely high are Muslim countries. Niger, 80% of the people. South Sudan, 73% illiteracy rate. Guinea, Burkina Faso, 64%. Central African Republic, 63%. Afghanistan, 61% of illiteracy rate that is going on among us. So what we end up having is we are putting ourselves at a disadvantage as an ummah because our people are illiterate. The Muslim universities, we don't have anything comparable to Harvard or Stanford or Cornell, or Yale in the Muslim world. Why? When the first universities were set up in the Muslim world, the first university was set up by a Muslim woman who started it. So yet at this point in time, our universities can't even match or compare. So we are not producing educationally viable people who can compete on the world stage. And so the educational future of the Muslim Ummah is not very great. Then we have the West. There's a long history which we can't go into of how they came to be where they were, and the decay of the Muslims. But at the present moment, the Western world is dominating everything. And part of this reality is the promotion of materialism, where people have become comfortable with materialism as a almost not only a lifestyle, but an object of worship, where having stuff and pursuing stuff and enjoying stuff and as the most important thing. The technologies have become very advanced. The quest for money is an obsession, and the economic and military domination that the West have, especially the United States. I think the 10 other countries next in line don't have even come together, don't have the budget of the military for the United States. So, and then coupled with that, with having materialism and all of that, there's a severe moral degradation in the West. Because when you become attached to materialism, your attachment to Allah will diminish. And so we produce a kind of people whose whole world is obsessed with just more. American culture is 5% of the cultures in the world. Yet Americans, we're only 5%. And yet in terms of population and culture, yet we use 75% of the resources of the earth, for just America alone. 25% is rest for the rest of the world. So we find ourselves in a situation in which the Muslim world is unable to compete on many of these levels. Another big concern is population growth. Unfortunately, the Muslims countries are the ones that have the fastest growing population, especially in Africa. Africa is the fastest growing population. India and Asia, India is going to be equal to China very soon. And so the planet is straining and bursting to keep up, to provide water and or food for this growing population. Europe, the population is shrinking, but the Muslim world population is growing. And so it becomes a challenge of how do you feed and take care of all of these new Muslims that are being born constantly, and their population level is growing. And then we have refugees, which is another unfortunate, very sad thing that's happening. We have Pakistan, which has just had a flood. The refugee situation for Muslims, most of the Muslims in the world are, most of the refugees in the world are Muslims, which is another sad, very important thing. So you have, for example, Syria, 6 million refugees, is the highest in the world. They're followed by Venezuela, 4%, 4 million people, refugees. Then Palestine, 3 million. Afghanistan, 2.6 million. South Sudan, 2.2 million, which we mentioned South Sudan before in terms of illiteracy rate. And so the top 5 refugees in the world, Syria, Palestine, Afghanistan, South Sudan, all Muslims, Muslim countries. So what is happening is that now you have all of these Muslims needing to be taken care of. And then the refugee has another part of it. The people who are taking them in also suffer the strain. And so the country that takes in the most refugees, Turkey, have 3.6 million refugees. Jordan, Uganda, Pakistan, Lebanon, Sudan, Bangladesh, Iran, Ethiopia. These are the countries that are bearing the strain of taking in these refugees, and puts a further challenge to the Muslims in those countries. And so all of these problems exist in the global ummah. And as we talk about them, sometimes you might become despondent and depressed to realize on a global level, there is so much going on. It's important to know. As regards solutions are very difficult. It has to start with getting people to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You need massive programs and educational programs to bring people back to the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to get them to understand Tawheed, their relationship with Allah, to give them the basic teachings of Islam. Because when you practice Islam, it elevates you, it helps you to look at the world in a new place, to train them. So there need to be a great deal of programs all over for doing that. Number 2, people need to return to practice Islam. Right now, a lot of Muslims, they talk about Islam. We need people to practice Islam, not just to be a spectator on the side, just discussing Islam, holding conferences, talking about problems, discussing solutions, but no action is being taken. We need people to act, to be action-oriented. And then Muslims need to become involved in everywhere that you are living. You've got to get involved in tackling the problems of your area. You've got to see yourself as a leader. Kullukum ra, as the Prophet says, every one of you is a leader. We've got to take up the mantle of leadership and get involved, whether it's our homeowners association group, whether it's our PTA, wherever it is that we have an opportunity to be involved, Muslims have to begin to take on those challenges. And then we have got to really fight this detachment, this attachment of the dunya, to get fascinated by things in the dunya. We've got to learn and start to focus on how we're preparing for the akhirah. We've got to teach our people, because when you become not so fascinated with the dunya, you don't need much to survive. You don't have this innate desire to have the best car, the best this, the best that. You're able to be happy with little. And so you could spend your energies and your time and your resources to do the bigger things, because your daily ritual, your daily stuff, you don't need to be involved in this mad race of just acquiring stuff. And then we have got to return to family life. We have so much different genders now, so many confusion in family. Our Muslim communities are getting destroyed because our kids are becoming all kinds of different weird person, undermining the family life. Women marrying women, men marrying men, and all kinds of strange realities that we live in. We've got to return to getting people to understand what true family life is. And lastly, whenever we have the opportunity, as we know, all the different global disasters that are happening will affect Muslims as well. We don't want to talk too much about those, like climate change and everything, but there will be a reality, like in Pakistan, like Bangladesh, and so many places. So we have got to, whenever you have the capacity and the capability, we've got to get engaged in global solution as well. So this is a brief idea of some of the challenges and solutions that we have as an ummah. And the bright side of all of this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lahu ma fis samawati wa ma fil ard, that Allah still owns everything that is in the earth and on the planet, and that Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu, that Allah will always protect and represent those who believe. So we have Allah as the balancing to all of this. You put all that on one side of the scale, and we have Allah on the other side of the scale, we will always win. So we have to continue being resolute, strong, be patient, work very hard and smart, and continue to live lives of ambition and constructiveness, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.